My name is Ethan Cole, Senior Park Ranger at Mount Rainier National Park, and I've served these woods for nearly 15 years. I've pulled lost hikers from ravines, carried broken climbers down from the summit, and watched storms carve entire valleys into new shapes overnight. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what the forest showed me last fall. If you're listening to this, it's because someone found my field journal. Maybe you think this is just another ranger story. Maybe you think it's fiction. I thought that too, until I saw myself standing 50 feet ahead on the trail, waving me forward. It started with a scream, not the wild kind that echoes from distant hikers or tourists who slip on wet rock. This one was short, a human noise cut off halfway, swallowed by the trees. I remember the way it seemed to come from everywhere, rolling through the fog like thunder that never decided where to land. We'd been out there for 2 days, me and the rookie, Daniel Ruiz, 26 years old, fresh out of search and rescue training, still bright-eyed enough to think the forest was a place of order. That morning fog had hung so thick along the Carbon River Trail that even our headlamps caught only floating dust instead of light. The temperature had dropped fast, too, despite it being early September, the kind of cold that made your breath cling to your face mask and your radio crackle with static. We were looking for a boy named Cameron Blake, 9 years old, missing since Sunday. His family had been hiking the Glacier Basin Trail when he'd run ahead and vanished around a bend. Search efforts turned up nothing. No footprints, no scent trail for the dogs. It was as if the forest had simply opened its mouth and swallowed him. "Fog's too heavy," Daniel muttered beside me, adjusting his pack. "We should have waited till it lifted." "The first 48 hours are everything," I said. "The forest won't wait for us." That was something I used to believe, that the woods were predictable if you respected them, that every rustle had a logical explanation. The forest wasn't cruel, it was indifferent. I repeated that like a mantra for years. Then came that scream. We froze. The radios crackled once, then went dead. I turned toward the sound, but the fog made the world unreal, just endless shades of silver and pine. "Cameron!" I called out, but my voice came back at me, quieter, distorted, as if something repeated it from farther inside the trees. We moved fast, careful not to lose each other in the mist. Every crunch of gravel under our boots sounded too loud. Then, through the white haze, a dark shape emerged, a clearing, an unnatural circle of flattened ferns and soil. Daniel raised his flashlight. The beam found something small and red tangled in the grass. A child's windbreaker. The name tag sewn on the collar read, "C. Blake." But what made my stomach twist wasn't the jacket. It was what lay beside it. A line of animal bones, small, clean, arranged in a perfect spiral pointing inward, not scattered, not torn apart, placed. "Coyotes?" Daniel asked, voice tight. I crouched, touching one of the bones. They were cold but dry, as if they'd been here longer than the boy had been missing. "No predator does this," I said. "Not even humans." That's when the radio clicked. A faint voice, static, broken syllables. Then, "Cole, do you copy?" It was my voice. Daniel and I exchanged a look. He whispered, "That sounded like you." "Bad frequency," I muttered, but even I didn't believe it. I reached for the radio again. "This is Ranger Cole. Identify yourself." Nothing but the sound of breathing came through, not mine, not Daniel's. A slow inhale, a wet exhale, close enough that I could almost feel it on the back of my neck. Then silence. Daniel started to say something, but I raised a hand. "Listen." Somewhere ahead, deep in the fog, a faint rhythm began, like someone knocking wood against a tree trunk. 2 beats, pause, 2 beats, pause. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. We followed the sound because that's what rangers do. You follow signs, you find people, you bring them home. That's the promise you make when you wear this uniform. But the deeper we went, the quieter everything became. No birds, no water, just our breathing and the occasional drip of moisture from the canopy. Then, after about 200 yards, the knocking stopped. Daniel pointed ahead. There! Through the fog, a human silhouette stood between the pines. Same height as me, same build, wearing a ranger's jacket. He, or it, lifted a hand and waved. I froze. Stay here. Wait, that looks like... I said stay here. I took a step forward. The figure didn't move. Another step. The fog thinned just enough for my flashlight beam to reach its face. It was my face. Identical, same scar on the eyebrow, same mud on the uniform, except the smile, that wasn't mine. Ethan, Daniel called softly from behind me. I didn't answer. The copy tilted its head, still smiling. Then, without a sound, it stepped backward and vanished into the fog. I ran forward, but the space where it had been was empty. No footprints, no disturbed grass. Just cold air that smelled faintly of something sweet and rotten. When I turned around, Daniel was gone. "Daniel!" I shouted, spinning in circles. My voice hit the trees and came back wrong, lower, slower, like someone mimicking me from deep underground. For 10 minutes I searched that fog-blind trail, calling his name, checking my compass again and again as the needle spun uselessly. Finally, I found his flashlight lying in the dirt, still on, beam trembling. Beside it, in the mud, were his boot prints. And one more set, barefoot, adult-sized. That was 3 months ago. Since then, the Park Service has filed its reports. The families have grieved. And I've been told to take some time off. But time doesn't change what I saw. And sleep doesn't bring peace. It only brings the sound of that slow knocking. Something lives in the forest I swore to protect. Something that wears faces like mine. If you're still listening, don't dismiss this as a campfire story. I've given my life to this place, and it's changing. The silence out there, it isn't empty, it's listening. And if you ever hear your own voice calling from the trees, don't answer before we go deeper into what really happened out there, into what the official reports won't tell you. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. It's the only way this story keeps going, and trust me, what comes next will make you question every sound you've ever heard in the woods. By the time I stumbled back to the ranger station, the fog had lifted. The morning sun spilled over Mount Rainier's snowy crown, painting the treetops gold. From a distance it looked peaceful, like the mountain had never held anything dark at all. Inside the station, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. The familiar smell of old coffee and pine cleaner grounded me, but my hands still shook as I filled out the incident log. My supervisor, Chief Ranger Alan Price, walked in just as I reached the section labeled Witness Observations. "Where's Ruiz?" he asked. The question hit harder than any reprimand. I looked down at my mud-caked boots. He was right behind me, then he wasn't. Alan leaned against the desk, his jaw tight. He'd been with the Park Service 30 years, the kind of man who believed every mystery had a logical answer, usually human error. "We'll send out another search team," he said. "You're not going back out there today, understood?" I nodded, though my mind was still out in that fog. "Sir," I said quietly, "I saw something. Someone that looked like me." He frowned. "Like a mirror reflection?" "No, it moved on its own. It waved." Alan studied me for a long moment. You've been running on no sleep, Cole. The woods do strange things to your head when you're tired. I wasn't tired. My voice came out sharper than I intended. I know what I saw. He exhaled slowly, like he'd heard this before. You've got 48 hours mandatory rest. Go home, eat, sleep. We'll handle the search. I wanted to argue, but the truth was my thoughts were tangled. Too many fragments colliding in my head. The scream, the bones, my voice on the radio, Daniel's empty footprints. I went home to my cabin near Ashford, just a few miles outside the park boundary. The place was small, wood stove, one bedroom, a porch that faced the forest. It had always been my refuge, my retreat after long shifts. But that night, it felt wrong. The air inside was still too heavy. I set my radio on the kitchen counter and turned the volume up. The static filled the silence like white noise therapy. I poured whiskey into a tin mug and stared out the window. Pines stretched for miles, black silhouettes against the fading sky. Somewhere in that darkness, Daniel was missing. When sleep finally came, it wasn't restful. I dreamed I was standing in the clearing again, the one with the spiral of bones. Except this time, I wasn't alone. A figure stood where the spiral ended, its back to me. Its hair and uniform matched mine perfectly. When it turned, I saw my own face, eyes hollow, mouth open in a silent scream. I woke to the sound of knocking, 3 sharp raps at the door. I checked the clock. 3:12 a.m. The porch light flickered as I opened the door. No one there, just the cold night air and the forest, whispering softly with wind. Then I saw them, footprints in the frost, bare feet, adult-sized, leading from the edge of the trees to my porch. They stopped at the welcome mat. No prints leading away. I followed them with my flashlight, heart pounding. They were perfectly shaped, toes defined. The frost melted around each step. I reached the last print before the tree line. The beam caught something white against the dark soil, a single pine needle stuck upright in the ground. It shimmered faintly, even though the light wasn't on it. The next morning I called Alan. "We need to talk," I said. He met me at headquarters, his face unreadable. "You said you saw footprints," he said, as I showed him the photos I'd taken. "And they just stopped?" "Yes, like the person vanished." He nodded slowly. "I'll add it to the report." Something in his tone made me stop. "You've heard this before, haven't you?" Alan didn't answer. He closed the file, locking it in a metal cabinet. "We follow protocol, nothing more." "Daniel's still out there." "The teams found nothing." He looked tired. "We'll keep the search limited for 48 more hours. After that, we shift resources." Shift resources. That meant give up. I left the station, frustration burning through the fog that had started to roll back in. The forest seemed quieter than usual, like it was holding its breath. By dusk, I couldn't stay home. I grabbed my gear and drove back to the Carbon River trailhead. The radio crackled with faint interference as soon as I crossed the park boundary. I should have turned back. But I didn't. The first 2 miles were silent except for the crunch of my boots. I called Daniel's name a few times, more out of ritual than hope. The sun sank behind the ridge, painting the mist orange and gray. Then I saw the movement, something darting between the pines. I raised my flashlight, but the beam caught only falling snow. My pulse thudded in my ears. A voice broke through the static on my radio. "Ethan!" It was Daniel. His tone was faint, slurred, like he was speaking underwater. "Daniel, where are you?" The radio hissed. "Don't follow the echoes." "Say again." Static swallowed his reply. I ran toward the sound, branches clawing at my sleeves. The forest grew darker, the air colder, and then, out of nowhere, I broke into another clearing, one I'd never seen before. A single Douglas fir stood in the center, enormous and ancient, its trunk carved with spirals like those bones from before. At its base lay Daniel's ranger badge, half buried in the dirt. I knelt to pick it up and stopped. Under the soil, pale shapes pressed up from below, fingers, human fingers reaching towards the surface. I stumbled back, heart hammering. The ground shifted, sighing like breath. Then everything went still. I backed away slowly, clutching the badge. When I turned, fog had filled the clearing again. For a moment, I thought I saw movement behind the tree line, someone watching me. But by the time I blinked, it was gone. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. By the time I made it back to the highway, the radio came alive with a sudden burst of sound, voices overlapping, distorted, but clear enough for one phrase to cut through. "You protect me." The signal died immediately after. That night, I sat on the porch until dawn, staring at the tree line. I wanted to believe there was a rational answer. Gas pockets, sound reflection, exhaustion. But deep down, I knew what the forest was doing. It was watching, waiting, testing, and somehow it had learned my voice. The next morning brought a sky so blue it almost felt like an apology. Sunlight spilled through the window of my cabin, catching on the ranger badge I'd found near the tree. It sat on the table beside a cup of coffee gone cold. I kept turning that badge over in my hand, trying to convince myself it was evidence of something explainable. Maybe Daniel had dropped it before getting lost. Maybe the ground shifting under my feet was nothing but a trick of panic and bad footing. The mind bends easily when it's tired. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wanted something from me. Around noon, I drove down to the town of Ashford to meet an old contact, Martha Jennings, a retired mountaineer and volunteer historian for the park. Martha had been part of search teams long before I joined. She knew every local story, every forgotten trail. If anyone could help make sense of what I'd seen, it was her. She lived in a cedar cabin near the edge of the Nisqually River. The place smelled of wood smoke and strong tea. When she opened the door, she gave me a long look. "You look like you haven't slept in a week," she said. "2 days," I admitted. "I need your help with something." I told her about the missing boy, about Daniel, and about the spiral pattern I'd found in the clearing. I left out the part about seeing myself. Some details felt too fragile to speak aloud. Martha listened quietly, stirring sugar into her tea. "You ever heard of the Echo Valley camp?" she asked when I finished. I frowned. "Can't say I have." Logging outfit from the 1890s. Whole camp vanished after an early winter storm. No sign of them when rescue teams arrived. Just their tools, their tents, and a single pattern in the snow. Circles like something pressed down from above. She took a sip. Locals called it the forest's echo, said it repeats what we bring into it. I leaned forward. Repeats? Fear, guilt, anger, whatever people carry. The mountain amplifies it. Some places do that, you know. Not haunted, just reflective. It sounded like folklore, but her calm delivery made it harder to dismiss. "You think that's what's happening now?" "I think the forest remembers things, and if you've seen what you said, it might be remembering you." Her words hung in the air long after I left. Driving back toward the park, I caught myself scanning the tree line. Everything looked normal. The trailheads busy with hikers, birds cutting through the sunlight. But under that calm, there was a strange pressure in my chest, as if the mountain itself was watching. At headquarters, Alan met me with a thin folder. "We wrapped the search, he said. "No trace of Ruiz, no new leads on the boy either." "That's impossible," I said. "He wouldn't just disappear." Alan's tone stayed even. "We'll keep his file open, but resources are limited. You should stand down, Cole." I wanted to argue, but exhaustion won. "If you're closing the case, I'll review the reports myself." He hesitated, then slid the folder across the desk. "Take it home, but don't go looking for ghosts out there." Back at the cabin, I read every page. GPS logs, witness statements, photos from search drones. Nothing out of place until I reached the final image. It was taken from a thermal camera the night Daniel vanished. Amid the outlines of trees and brush, one shape stood out. A human figure, faintly visible, standing motionless near the clearing. The timestamp placed it after I'd already returned to the station. I stared at the blurred image for a long time. Maybe it was a glitch, maybe not. When the power flickered that evening, I didn't think much of it, until my radio, sitting silent on the counter, snapped on by itself. Static filled the room, followed by a familiar voice. Mine. "Carbon River Trail," it said softly. "You missed something." I froze. Then, slowly, I reached for the dial and shut it off. The cabin sank back into silence except for the wind rattling the window panes. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept circling the same questions. What if the forest wasn't trying to frighten me? What if it was showing me something I'd ignored? By dawn, I'd made a decision. I'd go back one more time, carefully, rationally, with proper equipment, cameras, GPS, field notes. If there was a logical explanation, I'd find it. Before leaving, I slipped Daniel's badge into my pocket, not as superstition, just a reminder of what was at stake. The trail was quieter that day. The fog stayed high, drifting like smoke above the pines. When I reached the clearing, sunlight filtered through in pale stripes. The spiral of bones was gone, replaced by faint impressions in the soil, as if something heavy had pressed the ground smooth. I set down my camera and began photographing the area. That's when I noticed a faint hum, like air moving through hollow wood. I followed the sound a few steps and found a small gap in the hillside, half hidden by moss, a narrow cave, maybe an old lava tube. Inside, the air was cold and damp. The beam of my flashlight caught mineral streaks glistening on the walls. 10 feet in, the tunnel ended abruptly in rock. Nothing more, just stone and silence. But as I turned to leave, my radio crackled faintly from my pack. One short burst of static, then a clear tone, 2 quick beeps, a pause, 2 more. The same rhythm I'd heard in the fog that first night. I switched it off before it could finish. Outside, the sky had shifted. The light was softer now, almost silver. The pines swayed gently as though something unseen had moved among them. I stood there for a long moment, breathing in the scent of sap and earth, trying to remind myself that the forest was only what it had always been: trees, soil, wind. Still, part of me couldn't shake Martha's words. The forest repeats what we bring into it. If that was true, what had I brought? I packed up and started back down the trail. The mountain stayed quiet, but the silence wasn't comforting anymore. It felt like waiting. The next few days passed in a strange blur. I went through the motions of normal life, logging patrol reports, answering routine calls from tourists, and pretending the world made sense again. But under the surface, my thoughts kept drifting back to the clearing, the hum inside that cave, and the voice that had sounded like mine on the radio. It was subtle, but something in the park had shifted. The birds moved differently, the air felt charged, and even the color of the trees seemed deeper, richer, as if the whole forest was quietly aware of me. That's when Dr. Lila Monroe arrived. She was a field biologist assigned to Mount Rainier for a short-term research grant, studying animal migration and soil changes after the summer storms. I'd met her a few times over the years, sharp-minded, patient, always ready to challenge a ranger's certainty about what normal meant. "Ethan," she said when she showed up at the station, brushing snow off her jacket, "I heard you found something interesting near Carbon River." "Word travels fast," I said. "I ran into Alan Price in town. He didn't say much, but he looked uneasy." I hesitated. Uneasy fits. Over coffee, I told her everything I could, without sounding like I was losing my grip, about the missing ranger, the strange patterns in the ground, the echo on the radio, and the small cave with the hum that came from nowhere. She listened carefully, then said, "You ever think it might be seismic? There have been microquakes all across the Cascades. Vibrations can do odd things. Echoes, harmonics, low-frequency sounds that mess with perception." I nodded. That would explain a lot, but not all of it. "Then let's check it out," she said simply. So we did. We hiked out early the next morning, snow crunching under our boots. The trail was quiet, calm. For once, I almost believed I'd exaggerated the whole experience, until we reached the clearing. Lila paused, scanning the space. "You said this used to be a spiral?" "Yeah, but the soil's been smoothed over." She knelt, brushing her fingers across the dirt. "There's compression here," she said. "Something heavy pushed down in a pattern, but it's old, maybe weeks." I set up the motion camera while she placed her sensors near the cave entrance. The hum wasn't there this time, just the soft drip of melting snow. "Could be airflow," she said, holding a small device that tracked vibrations. "There's a cavity deeper in the hill, maybe a collapsed lava tube. You ever explored this area before?" "No, it's not on any of our maps." "Then maybe that's where your echo came from." Her tone was logical, grounding. For the first time in weeks, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. Maybe there was a simple explanation after all. We spent the next hour recording soil readings and setting up thermal sensors. Lila's calm precision helped me focus again. The forest looked almost beautiful in the morning light, the way mist curled through the pines, the sparkle of frost on fallen needles. "You really love this place, don't you?" she asked quietly as she worked. "I used to," I said. "Now I'm not so sure it loves me back." She smiled faintly. "Maybe it's just testing you." When we packed up, I felt a strange mixture of relief and regret. As we started back down the trail, I glanced over my shoulder. The clearing was empty, but it carried a stillness that felt almost aware of our departure. Back at headquarters, Lila reviewed the data. "No strange frequencies," she said. "No radiation, no seismic spikes. Just silence." "Silence can be data too," I said. She gave me a look, half curious, half cautious. "You really think there's something conscious in those woods?" "I think consciousness comes in forms we don't recognize." That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the way she'd said, "testing you." Later, as I sat on my porch watching the forest fade into dusk, my radio chirped once, just once, before falling silent again. Not a word, not even a sound, just a pulse of static like a heartbeat. I didn't move. I just listened. The next morning, Lila called. "You'll want to see this," she said. "Check your phone." She'd sent a short video from one of her sensors, the one near the cave. It showed a few seconds of motion capture data, low resolution, black and white. Most of it was still, but for a single frame, something flickered. A faint shape that looked like a person walking past the camera. Too tall and too thin for normal proportions. "It could be interference," she said when we met at the lab. "But it's odd that it triggered heat readings." Heat? Yeah, whatever passed in front of it was warm. Not animal warm, human warm. I didn't know what to say. We decided to leave the equipment running for another week. In the meantime, life went on as usual. Tour groups, weather reports, snow warnings. But every time I checked the tree line, I couldn't shake the thought that the forest was waiting for me to make the next move. On the 5th day, I hiked back to retrieve the cameras. The trail was quiet again, except for the wind sighing through the pines. When I reached the clearing, everything looked untouched. The cave entrance, however, was different. Someone, or something, had stacked small stones in front of it. A neat pile, waist-high, shaped almost like a doorway. I stood there for a long time, uncertain what to feel. It wasn't frightening exactly, more like the forest was answering back. When I returned, Lila studied the footage from the same morning. "You see that?" she said, pointing at the screen. At 8:47 a.m., an hour before I arrived, the stones had been there already, but as the video played backward, frame by frame, I saw something strange. The pile didn't appear. It was already standing when the camera started recording. And in the reflection of one smooth rock, the camera caught the faint outline of a ranger standing nearby. Hat, jacket, posture exactly like mine. Except I hadn't been there yet. Lila looked up at me, confused. "Ethan, when exactly did you say you left the station this morning?" I didn't answer, because deep down, I realized I couldn't be sure anymore. I spent that night replaying the footage over and over. Each time the image of the ranger shape reflected in that rock looked a little clearer. I could almost see the faint outline of a badge, the tilt of the hat, even the way the figure's hand rested on its hip, a stance that looked disturbingly familiar. I wasn't afraid. Not exactly. What I felt was something colder, heavier, a realization that the deeper I looked, the more the forest reflected me back. By morning, the sky had turned the color of steel. A slow rain fell across the valley, soaking the pines until the air smelled of resin and soil. I sat in my truck outside the ranger station, waiting for Lila. When she finally arrived, she looked as if she hadn't slept either. "I ran the footage through an enhancement program," she said, sliding into the passenger seat. "You should see this." On her tablet, the still frame came into focus. The reflection in the rock was sharper now. It wasn't just similar to me, it was me. The face, the gear, even the small scar above my eyebrow. I forced a laugh that sounded hollow. "Must be a lens distortion, or you pulled the wrong timestamp." "I didn't," she said quietly. "Ethan, that image was recorded at 8:47 a.m. You clocked out of the station at 9:03. You weren't there yet." The rain drummed against the windshield. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, Lila said, "Do you think someone could be, I don't know, impersonating you? Maybe a prank, a glitch in the data." "Or maybe it's just what Martha said," I murmured. "The forest repeats what we bring into it." She looked at me, frowning. "You mean it's copying you?" "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's not random." I didn't want to go back to that clearing again. Every instinct in me said to leave it alone. But curiosity has a gravity all its own. It pulls harder the more you resist. That afternoon, I grabbed my gear and headed back out. Lila didn't try to stop me. She just said, "Keep the radio on this time." The rain had stopped, leaving a mist that clung low to the ground. The forest looked washed clean, almost peaceful, but beneath that peace was a hum, faint like the memory of thunder. When I reached the clearing, the stack of stones was still there. I circled it slowly, taking pictures from every angle. Up close, I noticed something new. The stones weren't just random. Each one had faint markings etched into its surface, lines, curves, and intersecting circles, almost like constellations. I crouched to study them, brushing away the moisture. The carvings weren't recent. They were weathered, maybe decades old. But what made my pulse quicken was a familiar symbol on the bottom stone. The insignia of the U.S. Forest Service. The same as on my badge. That shouldn't have been possible. I took a step back, trying to steady my breathing. The air around me felt thicker, charged with static. My radio crackled once, twice, then went dead, and then I heard it, a voice, soft and calm, drifting through the mist. "You shouldn't be here, Ranger." I turned sharply, scanning the trees. No one. The forest was still. "Who's there?" I called. The voice came again, closer now. "You keep searching for others, but maybe you're the one who's lost." Every sound in the forest seemed to vanish at once. No wind, no birds, no dripping water. Just silence so complete it pressed against my eardrums. Then, from between the trees, a figure stepped forward. For a second, I thought it was Daniel Ruiz. Same build, same uniform, until I saw the details. The patches were faded, the badge tarnished, and the face was half-shadowed under the brim of the hat. "Daniel?" I whispered. The figure tilted its head as if curious. "You're late," it said in my voice. I took an involuntary step back. "Who are you?" The figure smiled faintly. My smile mirrored perfectly. "You already know." The mist swirled, and when I blinked, it was gone. No sound of movement, no footprints on the wet ground. Just the lingering scent of pine and something colder, metallic. I stood there for a long moment, breathing hard, waiting for logic to catch up. Finally, I pulled out my notebook and wrote the only words that made sense. If the forest repeats what we bring, what happens when it starts creating its own version? Back at headquarters, I found Lila waiting. She took one look at my face and didn't ask what happened. Instead, she said, "You need to see this." She turned her laptop toward me. The motion cameras had picked up something new. Not a shape this time, but a sound. A rhythmic sequence of tones buried in the static, like a coded message. When converted into visual form, it made a pattern, a spiral, identical to the one I'd found carved in the ground. At its center was a single word formed by frequency spikes, echo. Lila leaned back, staring at the screen. "What does it mean?" "I think," I said slowly, "it's calling us back." She gave a nervous laugh. "Calling us like an invitation? Or a warning?" I reached for the power button, but before I could touch it, the laptop flickered. The screen went black for half a second, then flashed an image. The clearing, live feed from one of the cameras. Except this time there was a person standing where the stones had been, facing the lens, wearing a ranger's uniform, and holding something in their hand. Lila froze. "Is that—" "Yes," I said quietly. "That's me." But I was here, inside the station. The feed glitched once more, then cut to static. I shut the laptop. "Pull every camera out of that area," I said. "We're done for now." As I drove home that night, the forest loomed dark and silent beside the road. The rain started again, soft and steady. Through the windshield, I saw flashes of movement, maybe deer, maybe tricks of light. When I reached my cabin, I sat in the truck for a long time, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. Then I looked up. Across the road, just beyond the tree line, a single light flickered, pale, steady, rhythmic. Not fire, not a flashlight, more like the glow of something waiting to be noticed. I closed my eyes and exhaled. Whatever this was, it wasn't finished with me. Not yet. The night after the video feed showed my double, I didn't sleep at all. Every creak of the cabin made me flinch. Every time the heater kicked on, I expected to hear that same faint hum again, hidden under the sound of wind. At some point near dawn, exhaustion won. When I finally woke, gray light was pushing through the blinds and my radio, the one I'd turned off, was humming again. A soft, rhythmic tone pulsing through static, 2 beeps, a pause, 2 more, the same pattern. I sat up, heart hammering. Then I heard Lila's voice on the other end, shaky but urgent. "Ethan, are you awake? You need to come to the lab, right now." When I arrived, she was pacing the small research room, a mug of cold coffee forgotten on the desk. Her laptop screen was filled with frequency graphs, the kind of data only a scientist could read at a glance. "You said the word that appeared on the feed was echo, right?" she said, pushing the laptop toward me. "Yeah, why?" "Because it's not just a word anymore, it's a pattern, a coded signal." The lines on the graph pulsed like heartbeats, repeating at precise intervals. "I ran it through a sound mapping program," Lila continued, "and it's not random, it's transmitting from multiple sources. Below ground." "Below?" "Exactly. The same frequency repeats in 5 locations, all near subsurface tunnels and lava tubes under Rainier." I frowned, leaning closer. "How deep are we talking?" "About 200 feet down. Some of those tubes were sealed off decades ago after collapses. No human access anymore." "So what's sending it?" She hesitated. "That's the part I can't explain. It's too coordinated to be geological. Too deliberate." A silence stretched between us, the kind of silence that makes you aware of every tiny sound in the room. Finally, she said, "You told me once you didn't believe in coincidences out here." "I don't." "Then maybe this isn't one." That day, we presented our findings to Alan Price, the station chief. He listened, polite but detached, fingers steepled under his chin. When Lila finished, he exhaled slowly. "I appreciate your enthusiasm," he said. "But the Park Service isn't equipped for this kind of research. If you're picking up underground interference, that's a geological matter." "With all due respect," Lila said, "it's not geological interference, it's a transmission." Alan gave a tight smile. "Then maybe it's equipment feedback. I'll forward your data to headquarters, but in the meantime, drop it. We have an avalanche watch on the North Slope, and I need both of you focused on public safety." He stood, signaling the meeting was over. Outside, Lila kicked a patch of frozen snow. "He doesn't believe a word of it." "He believes it," I said quietly. "He just doesn't want to." We decided to keep working on our own. Every night after shifts ended, we met at my cabin, reviewing the data, listening to the tones. They weren't just noise. There was structure, rhythm, and more unsettling. Every few hours, the tone would change slightly, like it was responding to something we did. On the 3rd night, we noticed a pattern in the timestamps. Each signal spike occurred precisely 13 minutes after one of us spoke the word echo aloud. "It's reactive," Lila whispered, "like it's listening." "Or mimicking," I said. We tried an experiment. I spoke into the radio. This is Ranger Ethan Cole. If you can hear me, repeat the pattern twice. Nothing, only static. Then, exactly 13 minutes later, 2 bursts of tone. Lila covered her mouth. It responded. I looked at her, unsure if I should feel wonder or dread. Maybe we're not the only ones studying something. That night, as we sat by the fire, she asked quietly, "Why does this feel personal to you? You've been on edge since the first day." I hesitated. Because this isn't the first time someone I worked with disappeared. She waited. 6 years ago, I said. Before Rainier, I was stationed in the Rockies. A partner of mine, a good friend, vanished during a patrol. His name was Tom. They said it was an accident, but before he disappeared, he'd been hearing something too. A tone in the radio. Almost identical to this one. Lila's brow furrowed. You think it's connected? I think some things never stop repeating. They just change shape. She looked at me for a long time, then nodded slowly. Then we keep going. Carefully. We mapped the 5 signal sources across the mountain and found one location that stood out. The Paradise Glacier sector, near an old maintenance tunnel sealed in the 1970s. If the signal truly came from below, that was the most likely origin point. We made a plan. Head there at first light, test the frequency on site, and record any interference. Nothing reckless, nothing illegal, just evidence. When dawn came, the air was crisp and silent. The world felt stripped down to essentials: snow, rock, sky, and our breath. We hiked for nearly 3 hours before reaching the tunnel entrance. The sign nailed to the rusted gate read, "Access restricted, geological instability." The padlock had corroded so badly it fell off when I touched it. Inside, the tunnel was cold and narrow. Rusted pipes lined the walls, dripping condensation. Every sound echoed. Footsteps, voices, the scrape of fabric. 50 yards in, the radio in my pack chirped twice, unprompted. The same pattern. 2 beeps, pause, 2 more. Lila looked at me, eyes wide. That's it. The signal was stronger now, louder. It wasn't random static anymore. It was layered, almost musical, like a low note played on a massive instrument buried beneath the earth. We reached a point where the tunnel forked, one path blocked by a cave-in, the other leading deeper into the dark. Lila adjusted her flashlight. It's stronger down there. I felt my pulse quicken. You sure? She nodded. Whatever's transmitting, it's close. We took a few cautious steps forward. The air grew colder, carrying a faint metallic tang. My flashlight beam caught something on the wall. Faded paint, half erased by moisture. It was a word, echo, and beneath it, a series of initials and dates, some going back decades. Lila exhaled slowly. How many people have been here before us? I traced one name with my gloved hand. DR, the missing ranger, Daniel Ruiz. The date next to it was only a few months old. Somewhere in the distance, deep in the tunnel, the tone pulsed again. Steady, patient, almost like a heartbeat. I turned to Lila. We found it, but she was staring past me, her face pale. Ethan, she whispered, your radio, it's recording by itself. I looked down. The red light on my radio's recorder was blinking. It wasn't set to record, and from its small speaker, layered beneath the static, came a voice, my voice, whispering words I hadn't spoken. Keep walking. For a long moment, Lila and I just listened to the sound echoing through the tunnel, that low, rhythmic tone that had brought us here. It wasn't sinister anymore, not really. It felt alive, yes, but more like the pulse of something natural, something hidden under the surface of the mountain. I switched off my radio and took a steady breath. "We're not alone in this data," I said. "Someone's been down here before." Lila nodded, studying the initials and dates on the tunnel wall. "Some of these markings go back decades," she said. "Could be old ranger maintenance records or researchers." She crouched near one of the older names, brushing away a layer of dust. "Look, see that stencil pattern? That's not handwriting. It's an equipment mark." "Meaning?" "Meaning this might have been part of a geological monitoring network. Before modern tech, scientists used low-frequency transmitters to measure stress shifts in volcanic rock. They called it acoustic mapping." I blinked, trying to process. "So the echo we've been hearing could be a machine," she said, "still running after all these years." That explanation hit me with both relief and curiosity. It wasn't supernatural. It was science that had simply been forgotten. We followed the tunnel deeper. It widened after 50 yards, opening into a large chamber carved directly into the rock. The walls shimmered faintly where moisture had crystallized. In the center stood a rusted metal console, half buried under decades of dust and sediment. "This is it," Lila murmured. "Acoustic Resonance Station 4. I've seen references to these in old geological reports." She knelt beside it, wiping away grime to reveal a small brass plaque. "Property of U.S. Geological Survey, 1974. The control panel was covered in switches and dials, most frozen in place. A single light blinked weakly, still powered somehow by a cable that disappeared into the wall. Lila's eyes widened. "It's operational," I laughed softly. "After 50 years? Don't underestimate analog tech," she said, smiling faintly. "Sometimes it outlives us." Together we brushed off the remaining dust. The console emitted a soft hum, the same tone we'd been hearing on our radios. Lila adjusted one of the dials and the pitch shifted slightly. "It's a feedback loop," she said. "The machine's still sending signals to remote sensors that probably don't exist anymore. The echoes are just it calling out and never hearing a reply." That image struck something deep in me. A lonely machine beneath a mountain, still doing its job long after anyone remembered it existed. "So the forest wasn't talking," I said. "It was just answering itself." "Exactly," Lila said. "It's an echo of human curiosity." I exhaled slowly, feeling some of the weight I'd been carrying start to lift. Maybe the things I'd thought I saw, the shapes, the reflections, were stress and coincidence, symptoms of a mind stretched thin. Still, as I looked around that chamber, something about it felt strangely personal. "Why was it sealed off?" I asked. "Budget cuts," she said. "The 70s were full of half-finished federal projects. They probably abandoned it and let nature do the rest." While Lila photographed the machinery, I walked toward a small alcove at the back of the chamber. Faded maps and handwritten notes were tacked to the rock, preserved by the dry air. One page caught my attention, a ranger report dated 1979. It read, "Acoustic Station 4 functioning normally. Minor interference recorded near the Southern Trail Network. Recommend partial shutdown until Ranger Patrol confirms cause. D. Ruiz." My stomach tightened, the same initials as my missing partner. Lila noticed the shift in my expression. "What is it?" "Nothing," I said quietly, folding the note and slipping it into my pocket. "Just proof someone cared enough to keep this going." We spent another hour cataloging the site. The further we looked, the more it felt like we were standing inside the mountain's memory. Every bolt and panel told a story of human persistence. Engineers, rangers, scientists who'd believed that the world's mysteries could be mapped if you just listened long enough. Before we left, Lila placed a new digital sensor beside the console. "It'll record for 72 hours, she said. "If anything changes, we'll know." Outside, daylight felt strange and brilliant after the dim amber of the tunnel. The mountain loomed massive above us, clouds drifting like slow thoughts across its face. For the first time in weeks, I felt something like peace. "Do you realize what this means?" Lila said as we hiked back down. "That sound you heard, that everyone dismissed, it wasn't madness. It was history calling back." I smiled faintly. So the mountain wasn't warning me. It was reminding me. "Of what?" "That we're temporary," I said. "But the things we build, the things we believe in, they echo long after we're gone." Back at the station, Alan met us at the entrance. His usual impatience was replaced by curiosity. "You two look like you've seen a ghost," he said. "Just an old machine," Lila replied. "Still trying to talk to the world." Alan raised an eyebrow. "Maybe that's a good metaphor for this job." He walked off, leaving us by the radio room. That evening, as I logged the day's report, I realized something unexpected. The fear that had haunted me since Daniel's disappearance wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was fear that maybe I'd been wrong to keep searching. Now, standing at the edge of understanding, I felt a different kind of weight. The responsibility that comes when mystery turns into meaning. Before I shut down the console for the night, I turned on my radio and listened one last time. The tone still hummed, faint but steady. Only now it didn't sound lonely. It sounded like memory. 2 days passed before we returned to the mountain. During that time, Lila analyzed every second of the data from her sensor in the old tunnel. She looked like someone who hadn't slept but didn't care, her mind fully alive, caught between logic and wonder. When I arrived at her lab, she was surrounded by screens filled with sound wave graphs. She looked up with that spark of discovery in her eyes. "You need to hear this." She pressed a key, and the soft hum we'd recorded played back through the speakers, low, steady, almost soothing. But as she adjusted the filters, faint new tones emerged. "Listen," she said. "This part's not machinery. It's too irregular." It wasn't speech exactly, just a rhythm like wind brushing through metal. Still, there was something oddly human in it. "What do you think it is?" I asked. She leaned back in her chair. "Echo patterns sometimes capture human interference. The station could have recorded old radio traffic, even voices from the original research team. Think of it like geological memory." The phrase stuck with me. Geological memory, the idea that stone and air could remember us. "Can you trace it?" She nodded. "I've been triangulating the origin points. The signals align with an older map, the early layout of the ranger stations from the 1970s. 4 of them line up perfectly, forming a rough circle. The 5th, the one we visited, sits in the center. I studied the coordinates. The circle's radius was nearly 10 miles. What was the purpose? "Maybe calibration," she said. "Maybe communication. Either way, whatever they started decades ago is still alive in the system." I couldn't help smiling. "So, in a way, we're just continuing their work." "Exactly." That afternoon, we briefed Alan again. This time, his skepticism was softer. He stared at the report, then looked out the window toward the mountain peaks. "You're saying this old network is still running, underground, unsupervised?" Yes, Lila said, and it's stable but unpredictable. The mountain's geology might be keeping it alive in a kind of loop. Alan rubbed his forehead. And it's harmless? Completely, I assured him. But it could be valuable. Historical data. Seismic readings. It's like finding a time capsule. He sighed. All right, you two have clearance to continue, but keep it quiet. Last thing we need is the press thinking we've got secret tunnels under the park. As he left, Lila grinned. That went better than I expected. Maybe, I said, or maybe he just wants us to prove what we already believe. The next few weeks blurred into a rhythm. We spent our days in the field, documenting every new reading, every shift in the signal. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed the feeling of discovery, the calm focus that replaces fear when you finally start to understand something. Still, at night, the tone from the transmitter stayed with me. I'd hear it faintly when I closed my eyes. Steady, patient, endless, like the mountain breathing. One evening, I sat outside the cabin watching the sky darken into silver. The stars began to appear one by one. Lila called from the station, her voice bright with excitement. "You won't believe this," she said. The signals changed frequency again, but this time it's synchronized with atmospheric pressure shifts. It's almost like it's responding to the weather. Meaning? Meaning it's adapting, like a self-correcting system. The thought was both beautiful and unsettling, not because it was dangerous, but because it reminded me how small we really were. That night, I returned to the tunnel to check the equipment one last time before winter storms made the path impassable. The air was cold enough to sting my lungs. Inside the chamber, everything was still. The hum of the old machine was softer now, like it was finally tiring after half a century of service. I placed a hand on the metal surface. It vibrated faintly beneath my glove, steady and calm. "You did your job," I murmured. "You can rest now." I turned to leave, but something caught my eye, a small, weathered notebook tucked behind a fallen panel. I pulled it free, brushing away the dust. The first page bore a faded name written in block letters, T. Howard, Ranger, 1975. I opened it carefully. The entries were simple: maintenance notes, dates, equipment tests. But near the end, one line stood out. "The echo is more than sound. It's reflection. It answers emotion, not words." I read it twice. Maybe he'd been speaking metaphorically. Maybe he'd simply spent too long underground and felt the same odd pull I'd felt. When I showed it to Lila the next morning, she smiled softly. "I like that," she said. "The echo as reflection. Like the forest mirrors the people who walk through it." "Maybe that's the real message," I said. "That we leave traces everywhere, even in places we can't see." She closed the notebook gently. "Then our job isn't to solve the echo, it's to listen to it." That line stayed with me long after she left for the day. Over the next week, the tone began to fade. Bit by bit, the hum softened until it was little more than background noise. It didn't vanish completely, it just settled, like a heartbeat going quiet after a long run. Lila believed the old power lines had finally failed. I preferred to think the mountain had finally gone to sleep. Either way, the silence that replaced it wasn't frightening. It was full of peace. In my final report, I wrote, "Acoustic Station 4 reactivated briefly in autumn conditions. Source of repeated frequencies confirmed to be residual geological survey equipment. No safety risk. Recommendation: preserve site as historical artifact." It felt good to write that word, preserve, because that's what this was all about in the end. not chasing ghosts or proving legends, but preserving stories, ours and the mountains. When the season ended, Lila left for another research post in Oregon. We promised to stay in touch, though both of us knew the mountain had changed something between us. She'd brought light into a place that had nearly swallowed me. On her last day, she handed me a small silver recorder. "For your next field notes," she said, "just in case the forest decides to talk again." I smiled. "If it does, I'll be listening." After she drove away, I turned toward the mountain. The snow line had crept lower now, tracing the ridges like quiet veins. For the first time in months, I didn't feel watched. The forest was still, calm, listening, and maybe somewhere deep beneath the pines, the echo listened back, not to frighten, but to remember. Winter came early that year. The first snow dusted the valleys in late October, softening every sound, muting the forest until even my footsteps seemed polite. By December, most trails had closed, and the park felt suspended in time. Just white peaks, slow-moving clouds, and the quiet pulse of the land beneath. I stayed on as winter supervisor, handling safety checks and weather reports. The job was mostly solitude, long hours in the ranger tower, radio static whispering through the cold air. After everything that had happened, the silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. Still, the echo never left completely. Sometimes when the wind shifted just right, I'd hear that low vibration again, faint as a thought you almost forget. I didn't chase it. I simply listened. On one of those still afternoons, I received a postcard from Lila, a photograph of Crater Lake under a pale sky. She'd written, "The instruments here hum too. Maybe the earth just likes to sing. Don't forget to listen." Her words made me smile. Later that week, Alan drove up from the district office to inspect the towers. He'd mellowed since autumn, less brusque, almost curious. As we checked the equipment, he paused beside me, watching the snow drift between the pines. "You ever think about leaving this job?" he asked. "Once," I said. "A long time ago. But I realized I'm not done listening yet." He chuckled. "You and your echoes. Call it what you want," I said. "Some people write books to understand the world. I walk through it." Alan nodded, half smiling. "Maybe that's why the park needs people like you." When he left, I climbed the tower alone. The air was clear enough to see miles in every direction. White ridges, frozen rivers, the faint glint of sunlight on the volcano's crown. For a moment, I could almost imagine the whole mountain breathing under the snow. I pulled out the small recorder Lila had given me. The battery light blinked once, waiting. "This is Ranger Ethan Cole," I said softly. "Temperature's 28 degrees, wind from the north. No disturbances, just quiet." I hesitated, then added, "If anyone listens to this someday, if you ever wonder what the forest sounds like, when it's truly still, this is it." Only the hush of wind answered. Weeks passed like that, steady, peaceful. Each day felt like a page turned clean. The forest seemed content to rest, and I let it. Until one evening in January, a faint signal came through the main radio frequency, a tone nearly identical to the old one, followed by a short burst of static. Not threatening, not strange, just unexpected. I waited. Nothing followed. Curiosity stirred again, the same spark that had driven every ranger before me. I replayed the recording twice, then checked the direction finder. The source pointed west, toward the base of the glacier where the tunnel had been. By morning, I decided to hike out there, more out of respect than concern. Snow reached past my knees in places, glittering under the pale sun. The world felt lighter, quieter, every sound magnified, the creak of ice, the whisper of branches shedding snow. When I reached the old site, the entrance was sealed by frozen runoff. The metal sign we'd left months before, Acoustic Station 4, restricted, was half buried, edges rimed with frost. I brushed off the plaque and stood there for a while, breathing the cold air. The mountain was utterly silent. No hum, no signal, just the faint thrum of wind through pine needles. And then, as if on cue, my recorder clicked on in my pocket. It wasn't eerie, it was almost comforting. A soft tone, low and measured, filled the air for a few seconds before fading into stillness. I looked up at the slope, sunlight flashing across the ice like a heartbeat. "Still working," I murmured. "Still listening." I left the recorder there, tucked safely against the metal sign, its red light blinking in the snow. Let it collect what it wanted, the hush of winter, the small noises of the living world. Maybe someday someone else would find it and wonder what we'd been trying to hear. As I walked back down the trail, I thought of Lila's line. Maybe the earth just likes to sing. Maybe it does. Maybe that's all the echo ever was, a song the planet hums to itself, and we, by accident or faith, sometimes catch a note of it. That evening, from the tower, I watched the last light sink behind the ridges. The snow reflected orange for a moment, then slipped into blue. The forest below glowed faintly, alive even in sleep. For the first time, I understood why I'd never really been afraid of these woods. What frightened me wasn't their darkness. It was the idea that they might stop speaking altogether. I pressed the radio switch and said quietly into the static, "Trails clear tonight." The reply came as a simple echo of my own words, bouncing softly between the mountains. No mystery, no magic, just sound finding its way home. And somehow, that was enough. The following weeks were the kind that leave no sharp edges in memory, just quiet days stacked like stones. The work became simple again, checking snow levels, clearing ice from ranger signs, keeping an eye on the avalanche forecast. I started sleeping through the night. The strange dreams had faded, replaced by something gentler, like the forest itself had finally exhaled. When the February thaw came, it arrived softly. Water ran under the ice again, and the wind brought back the earthy smell of wet pine. I drove into town for supplies, and when I returned, sunlight was breaking through the clouds in thin gold beams. The mountain looked almost human. Shoulders, a spine, a heart beating below it all. At the cabin, a letter waited in the mail slot. It was from the Park Service headquarters, stamped internal memo. I expected another routine audit. Instead, it was a short request. Ranger Ethan Cole, submit final report and recommendations concerning the reactivation of acoustic survey equipment near Paradise Glacier. Archival teams will assess site for preservation. Preservation, the same word I had used. It felt good to see it travel outward, to know that what we'd found wouldn't vanish back into the mountain. I poured coffee and sat on the porch, notebook open, pen in hand. But before writing, I just looked. The valley spread wide below me, pines dusted with melting snow, the faint glint of the Nisqually River winding toward the horizon. Sometimes silence can speak more clearly than any report. When I finally wrote, it wasn't only about data. I wrote about how sound moves through a place, how even forgotten machines can still carry intention, how a person standing alone in a forest isn't cut off from the world, but connected to it through every vibration, every echo. When I finished, I signed my name and sat back, listening. A breeze swept through the trees, carrying a low murmur like distant surf. Later that evening, I drove to the main station to file the report. Alan was there, sorting through weather charts. He looked up as I entered. "You actually finished it," he said, smiling faintly. "Thought the mountain might keep you for itself." "It tried," I said. He read the first page, then looked at me. "You sound different, Cole." "Maybe I just stopped fighting the quiet." He nodded. "You staying on for spring?" "Yeah, someone has to keep listening." The drive home was calm, the road empty. As dusk settled, I thought about everything that had happened. The lost ranger, the strange tones, the fear that had turned into curiosity and finally into peace. It wasn't about ghosts or secrets anymore. It was about understanding that the world holds echoes of everyone who's ever cared enough to listen. At home, I checked the recorder I'd left near the tunnel. The light had gone out, the battery finally dead. When I played back what it had captured before shutting down, I heard nothing strange, just the natural rhythm of the mountain, snow sliding, wind moving through branches, a faint crackle like fire far away. But under it all, barely audible, was the hum, steady, patient, alive. I smiled. "Still there," I whispered. That night, I built a small fire outside the cabin. The flames cast moving shadows against the trees, like silent company. I thought of Lila, of her postcard, of the way her scientific certainty and my instinct for wonder had somehow met in the middle. Maybe that was the point. Not proving what the echo was, but remembering that discovery isn't just about answers, it's about attention. When the fire burned low, I switched on my radio one last time. The frequency crackled, then settled. "Ranger Cole, nightly check-in," I said. "Visibility clear, temperature 32 degrees. No disturbances." A brief pause, then, faintly, my own voice echoed back through the relay tower, a normal radio reflection delayed by distance. "Trails clear tonight." The sound made me smile. The forest was wide awake, and so was I. I turned off the radio, packed up my gear, and stood for a long time watching the stars appear, one by one, quiet as new thoughts. The air smelled of thawing earth and pine sap. Somewhere far below, under layers of rock and time, the old machines might still hum. Or maybe the sound was just the mountain itself, breathing, remembering, and sending a little of that memory into the open sky. I didn't need to solve it anymore. I just needed to be here, part of the echo. As I went inside, I caught my reflection in the window, not the double from my imagination months before, just a tired ranger, older, calmer, carrying a kind of peace he hadn't known he was searching for. I smiled at the reflection and said quietly, "You did all right." Outside, the wind shifted, brushing through the pines with a soft, even rhythm. 2 beats, a pause, 2 more. Not a warning, not a message. Just the mountain saying goodnight. When spring arrived at Mount Rainier, it didn't rush. It unfolded. The snow melted in patient streams, filling the rivers with silver ribbons. Pine needles shed their frost, the first birds returned, and the air changed from stillness to music. For the first time in months, the mountain didn't feel like it was holding its breath. I was assigned to the Southern Trails that season, an area with fewer tourists, but more history. The route curved through a forgotten research zone where moss-covered foundations hinted at old ranger cabins and weather stations from the 1940s. It was the kind of place where the past stayed visible if you knew where to look. By then, the echoes were just a memory. Or so I thought. It started small, During a patrol near the Cowlitz Divide, I came across a collapsed bridge, the kind that hikers were warned not to cross. While documenting it for repair, I noticed something etched into the wood of one of the old beams. Not graffiti, not initials, coordinates. They were faint but deliberate, carved with care. 46 degree 48 8 N, 121 dig P41 W. That placed it north, near the same ridge where the acoustic tunnels had been found months before. It could have been an old survey marker, but something about it felt intentional, like it was left for someone specific to find. That night, I entered the numbers into the database. Nothing matched any registered park sites, no historical entries, no maintenance logs. The only record near that point was a weather anomaly report filed 20 years ago, filed by T. Howard, the same name from the notebook we'd found in the tunnel. I sat back in my chair, feeling that old twinge of curiosity return. I'd promised myself I was done chasing mysteries in these woods, but the park had its own ways of calling you back. The next morning, I packed a light kit, GPS, camera, radio, and extra water. I didn't tell Alan, mostly because I knew how he'd react. Another coal investigation, as he'd call it. Half amused, half exasperated. The trail toward the coordinates climbed through dense cedar groves where sunlight fell in golden stripes. Every sound, the crunch of soil, the creak of branches, felt amplified. I'd walked these woods long enough to know when they were calm, and this day felt calm. Watchful, but not unfriendly. 2 hours in, I reached a plateau, overlooking a narrow valley. My GPS beeped. The coordinates were close. At first glance, there was nothing, just brush, fallen branches, and the skeletal remains of what might have been a small cabin long ago. Then I saw it, a signpost lying half buried in the soil. It was old, faded, nearly erased by time. I brushed the dirt off and made out the letters. Observation Point, Research Unit. 5. I took a few photos, crouched, and found something unexpected. Beneath the soil was a metal hatch, small and circular, no wider than a manhole cover. The hinges were rusted solid, but the handle moved slightly when I pressed it. The faint scent of iron rose up from beneath. A leftover from the old seismic experiments, maybe. Or another tunnel. The hatch was locked. I marked the coordinates and returned the next day with proper clearance tools. That night, though, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept circling back to T. Howard, the ranger from 1975 who'd written, "The echo answers emotion, not words." What emotion had led him here? Curiosity, fear, regret? When dawn came, I hiked back with my gear. The air was warm, full of that rich cedar scent that comes after early rain. I cleared the soil, unlocked the hatch, and slowly lifted it. The hinges groaned. A cool breath of air rose up, dry, stale, like something that hadn't been opened in decades. I switched on my flashlight and aimed it inside. The shaft went down maybe 20 feet before leveling into a short passage lined with corrugated metal. Not another tunnel system exactly, more like a maintenance access. I clipped my safety line, lowered myself down, and landed on firm ground. At the far end of the short passage stood a small metal box mounted to the wall, labeled Acoustic Relay Node B. I brushed off the dust and checked the wiring. Half the components had corroded, but one indicator light glowed faintly, still powered by some hidden line. Inside the box was a thin metal reel, the kind used to record analog sound. I removed it carefully, holding it like a fragile relic. The tape was labeled in black marker, Test Series 5C, May 12, 1975. When I played it later in the station lab, I expected static. Instead, The room filled with a low tone, steady and rhythmic. The same hum Lila and I had heard months ago. But this recording had something else layered beneath it. Faint, indistinct voices. Not eerie, not ghostly, just human. Technicians speaking in calm tones, reading measurements. Then one voice, clearer than the rest. An older man, steady and tired. Acoustic integrity confirmed. The reflection is stable. We can proceed with phase 2. Silence. Then, if anyone finds this, remember, it was never about sound. It was about presence. That was it. The reel clicked to an end. Presence. I sat back, my pulse steady but my thoughts racing. It wasn't about ghosts or machines or strange phenomena. It was about what we leave behind. The resonance of human effort, of curiosity, of care. The echo wasn't a haunting. It was history speaking through persistence. When I filed the discovery report that week, I wrote only what I could prove. But privately, I added a note for whoever might read it years from now. There's something timeless in these mountains. Not supernatural, just enduring. Every sound, every touch, every word finds a way to stay. We don't leave the forest unchanged, and it doesn't leave us unchanged either. That night, I stepped outside the station and looked up. The moon hung low, casting a silver path across the snowfields. Somewhere far away, water moved through stone, carrying with it faint vibrations from decades past. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real secret of the echo. It was never trying to be heard. It just wanted to last. The discovery of the old reel changed something in me. Not in a dramatic way, no great revelation or cosmic shift, but in the quiet sense that I'd been handed a story still half told. For weeks after, I couldn't stop thinking about that voice on the tape. The way he'd said presence like it meant more than science. There was empathy in it, a tenderness that didn't fit the usual cold precision of research language. Whoever T. Howard was, he hadn't just been taking measurements. He'd been listening with his heart as much as with his instruments. A few days later, I visited the archive room at headquarters. It smelled of old paper and dust, an entire wing dedicated to the park's history, each drawer labeled by decade and project. After some digging, I found a slim folder, Acoustic Survey Project 1974-1976. Inside were handwritten maintenance logs, faded photographs, and a few personal memos. One photo stopped me cold. 5 people standing beside a large cylindrical device in the forest. 4 of them smiling, one man looking off into the trees. He was middle-aged, with thick glasses and a ranger's patch on his shoulder. The name tag read, Howard. On the back of the photo, someone had written, "We thought we were measuring echoes. Turns out we were measuring time." I stared at it for a long time. The next morning, I asked Alan for clearance to trace the old project records. He shrugged. "If it keeps you busy and out of trouble, go ahead." So I spent the next few days piecing together a timeline. The acoustic project had been launched in the mid-70s, meant to study subsurface vibrations. Early earthquake monitoring mixed with experimental mapping of underground water flow. But the project was shut down after a year. The official reason, funding withdrawal. Unofficially, there was a note at the bottom of one memo. Personnel reported psychological fatigue and unexplained emotional phenomena. Recommend reassignment. Emotional phenomena. That phrasing made me laugh softly in disbelief. It sounded like bureaucratic language for, we started feeling things we couldn't explain. I took my notes home that evening. The air smelled of wet soil and cedar, spring pushing hard through the last crusts of snow. I poured a cup of coffee and set the old photograph on the table beside me. It felt strange, realizing how close my life had begun to mirror a stranger's from half a century ago. He'd been out here searching for meaning in sound, and now I was too. Later that night, as I packed up the files, something slipped from between two pages, a folded sheet of notebook paper. It wasn't part of the archive. It looked personal. I unfolded it carefully. It was a letter dated November 8th, 1975. To whoever continues this work, if you ever stand in this forest and hear the world hum back at you, don't be afraid. It's not trying to haunt you, it's trying to remember you. Sound is just another way of keeping presence alive. Every person who listens adds another layer to it. When the project ends, don't let the listening end with it. T. Howard. I read it twice, my chest tightening. That was it. The quiet wisdom I'd been searching for all along. Not ghosts, not echoes, just the way the earth keeps traces of those who've paid attention. The next day, I hiked back to the old observation site. The snow had finally melted from the hatch. I sat there for a long time, reading the letter again under the sunlight filtering through the branches. For the first time since joining the Ranger Service, I didn't feel small out here. I felt part of something bigger, a line of people who'd walked these same trails, stood in the same silence, asked the same questions, and found comfort in the same uncertainty. Before I left, I took a small piece of the rusted hatch plate and slipped it into my jacket pocket. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Sometimes discovery doesn't mean finding something new. It means understanding what was already there. That evening, I mailed a copy of Howard's letter to Lila in Oregon. No explanation, just a note. You were right, the earth does like to sing. Her reply came a week later. Maybe it's not the earth singing, maybe it's us, echoed back. I pinned both notes to the wall above my desk. Together they looked like a conversation across time. As spring deepened, I found myself guiding more visitors along the southern trails. Families, photographers, students, all drawn by the blooming wildflowers and clear rivers. I told them about the forest's geology, its wildlife, and its history. Sometimes I mentioned the acoustic projects, but never the word echo. That part I kept to myself. Still, every so often I'd pause mid-tour, listening as the wind moved through the trees, and I'd think, Howard, are you listening too? Because in a way, I think he was. One late afternoon, after the last hikers left, I stood by the edge of Reflection Lake. The surface was perfectly still, mirroring the snowy summit above. I tossed a pebble in, watched the ripples spread outward, distorting the reflection just enough to remind me of how delicate everything was, how even the smallest act leaves a trace. The ripples faded, but the image of the mountain returned, quiet and patient as always. I thought of Howard's last line, "Don't let the listening end." So I didn't. I pressed record on my field device and simply let it run. 10 minutes of water, birds, wind, no words, no analysis, just sound. When I played it back later, I noticed something subtle, barely there. A rhythm under the natural noise, steady and calm, like a slow heartbeat. Maybe it was just my own pulse echoing through the recorder, or maybe, as Howard said, it was the forest remembering that someone was still listening. Either way, I smiled. The silent season wasn't really silent at all. It just spoke in ways most people forgot how to hear. By late spring, the forest had changed color again. The snow line retreated higher up the ridges, and the valleys burst alive with green so vivid it felt almost unreal after months of white and gray. The mountain smelled of thawed soil, cedar sap, and renewal. Every day brought new sounds, meltwater trickling under logs, insects returning to the air, the soft call of a woodpecker somewhere deep in the pines. Each of those sounds reminded me that the forest wasn't a monument. It was a living thing, breathing and rebuilding after the long quiet. My patrols grew longer. Some days I walked for hours without speaking to anyone, and instead of feeling lonely, I felt balanced. The silence that once frightened me now felt like company. On one of those mornings, I met an older hiker named Maggie resting by a trail junction. She carried a worn pack and a camera, older than I was. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, and then she said something that stayed with me. "You ever notice," she asked, "how quiet can be louder than noise?" I nodded. I used to think quiet meant empty. Now I think it just means full of things I haven't learned to hear yet. She smiled, clicked a picture of the trees, and said, "That's the right answer." We walked together for a while, sharing the kind of small, thoughtful conversation that only seems to happen between people who understand silence. She told me she'd been hiking here since the early 1980s. Every season, she said, the mountain gives a different lesson. Some years it teaches patience. Some years, forgiveness. That line stayed with me long after we parted ways. Later that week, I hiked to Echo Ridge, a lookout point newly opened for the season. From there, you could see the full sweep of the glacier, its white shoulders stretching to the horizon. The wind there always carried a low murmur, steady as breath. I pulled out my recorder again and captured the sound for a few minutes. Listening through the headphones, I realized it wasn't just wind, it was the distant roar of thawing ice, a river being born again beneath the snow. Back at the cabin that night, I played it on repeat. There was a rhythm to it, like a song that didn't need instruments, just patience to understand its time. When Lila called a few days later, I told her about it. "You sound lighter," she said. "I guess I am," I admitted. "The mountain's teaching forgiveness this year." She laughed softly. "Forgiveness of what?" "Mostly myself." There was a pause. Then she said, "That's the hardest one." After the call, I stepped outside. The sunset painted the ridges in amber and rose. The air felt soft, and for the first time in a long while, I realized I wasn't waiting for anything to happen. I was just here. In the following weeks, I started mentoring new rangers. They were young, curious, eager to prove themselves the way I once had. One of them, a trainee named Lucas, asked me what the most important skill was for working in a national park. "Listening," I said without hesitation. "To the radio?" he asked, grinning. "To everything," I said. "The wind, the rivers, even the silence. If you can listen well enough, the forest tells you what it needs." He gave me a puzzled look, but I could see him turning the thought over in his head. That was enough. By early June, wildflowers covered the meadows like spilled paint. Visitors arrived daily, filling the air with laughter and camera clicks. And yet, even amid all that noise, the deeper quiet of the place endured. Patient, steady, welcoming. One evening, I hiked back to the ridge where I'd left my old recorder months ago. The batteries were long dead, the casing speckled with rust. I picked it up, brushed it clean, and smiled. It had done its job. It had listened. I placed it back where it had sat and whispered, "Thank you." On the way down, I thought of T. Howard's letter again. Don't let the listening end. Maybe that's what being a ranger really meant. Not just protecting trees or trails, but protecting the act of listening itself. That night, a gentle rain began to fall. I opened the cabin window and let the sound fill the room, the steady patter on the roof, the drip from the eaves, the quiet percussion of the earth drinking again. I picked up my field journal and wrote, "There's no such thing as silence here, only conversations too vast to fit into words. The mountain speaks in patience, the forest answers in time." When I set the pen down, I realized I'd been smiling. Outside, the rain softened into mist. Somewhere far above, the glacier creaked under its own weight, releasing tiny echoes into the valley. Not ominous, not strange, just reminders that everything alive leaves its sound behind. For the first time, I felt I understood what the echo had always been trying to teach me, that every moment, no matter how small, leaves a mark worth listening to. By midsummer, Mount Rainier shimmered beneath long daylight and clear skies. The air carried warmth and the easy rhythm of visitors passing through. Families, solo hikers, retired couples making slow progress up the trail with walking sticks, polished smooth from decades of travel. Every morning I checked weather instruments, logged temperatures, and greeted the sunrise as if it were an old friend. Nothing miraculous happened. That was the miracle. One afternoon, Alan stopped by the tower with a stack of brochures. "The visitor center wants a short evening program," he said. "Talks about the park from the ranger's point of view. You'd be good at that." I hesitated. I'm not exactly a showman. "You don't have to be," he said. "Just tell a story that matters." For years, I'd avoided public speaking. Too many memories felt raw, too many experiences too strange to explain without sounding unsteady. But maybe now was the time. That evening, I sat on the porch with a notebook, listening to frogs start their chorus along the river. What could I tell people about this place? Facts were easy. Acreage, elevations, wildlife counts. But those weren't the things that changed me. What changed me were the pauses, the space between a bird call and its echo, the stillness after a storm, the humility that comes when you realize the landscape doesn't need you to understand it. So I wrote about that, about learning to listen, about how the quiet doesn't erase your fear or grief. It teaches you to carry them more gently. When the night of the talk arrived, the small auditorium at the visitor center filled with maybe 30 people. Lantern light flickered on the walls, and the smell of coffee drifted from the back table. Lila wasn't there in person, but she'd sent a message wishing me luck. Alan introduced me simply, Ranger Ethan Cole, 15 years in these mountains. He knows what the silence sounds like. I stepped up to the microphone, palms slightly damp. Outside, twilight pressed against the windows. The forest waited just beyond the glass. "I used to think the quiet out here was emptiness," I began. "Then I learned it's actually full of movement, of memory, of echoes of everyone who's ever cared about this land." People leaned forward. I told them about my first year as a ranger, how I feared the dark, how storms could make the mountain feel alive. I described walking through fog thick enough to erase my own footsteps, and how, somewhere between fear and awe, I learned to stop asking the forest to explain itself. "It doesn't speak our language," I said. "It speaks in wind and ice and time. But if you listen long enough, you realize it's talking about endurance and kindness." I talked about the old research stations, the forgotten equipment, the voices of past rangers whose notes and recordings still shaped our work. I didn't mention the strange incidents directly, just the lesson they left behind, that listening is a form of respect. When I finished, the room was quiet in the best way, the way that means people are still inside the moment. Then someone started to clap, and the sound grew until it filled the room. Afterward, an elderly man approached. "You reminded me of my wife," he said. "She used to say silence was God's handwriting." I shook his hand, grateful for the simplicity of that line, God's handwriting. Maybe that's what we'd all been trying to read out here. Over the next few weeks, the talk became a regular event. Sometimes there were crowds, sometimes just a few listeners wrapped in blankets against the evening chill. I stopped reading from notes and started speaking from memory, letting each night's wind or bird call shape the rhythm. One evening, near the end of summer, I stepped outside after finishing and saw the valley spread below, mist curling through treetops like smoke. For a heartbeat, it felt as if all the years I'd spent on this mountain folded into one moment of stillness. Lila called again a few days later. She was working on a book about natural soundscapes blending science and storytelling. "I'm calling one chapter Echo as Memory," she said. "You might find your words in it somewhere." I laughed. "Then make sure they're the quiet kind." We promised to meet when her project brought her north again. By late August, the days shortened. The mountain slipped back into its slower breathing. The echo, real, imagined, or simply remembered, had faded into the background of ordinary life. Yet its lessons stayed bright. One afternoon I guided a group of school children up the ridge. They peppered me with questions about glaciers and bears and lightning strikes. When one little girl asked, "What's your favorite sound in the forest?" I paused. "The one that comes after everything else stops," I said. "That tiny moment when the world waits to see if you're paying attention." She nodded solemnly, as if she understood perfectly. That night, back at the cabin, I recorded a final note in my field log. The silence isn't an absence, it's an invitation. Every echo, every breath of wind, every footstep is part of the same conversation. We just have to remember to answer kindly. Outside, the first autumn breeze whispered through the trees. Somewhere far above, fresh snow would soon return to the peaks, covering the traces of summer. I closed my notebook, turned off the lamp, and listened, just listened, until the quiet filled the room with peace. By September, the mountain began to trade green for gold. The meadows were flecked with the last bursts of wildflowers, and the air carried that sharp, sweet scent that comes only at the turning of seasons. Every sound changed, softer, lower, slower. Even the rivers seemed to run in a deeper tone, as if the whole valley were humming its own farewell to summer. I'd lived through many seasons here, but this one felt different. It wasn't about surviving another cycle. It was about belonging to it. For the first time, I didn't feel like a watcher of the forest. I felt like part of its rhythm. My days fell into a quiet routine. I hiked the trails, checked equipment, shared brief greetings with passing hikers. Some recognized me from the evening talks at the visitor center. They'd stop to thank me, telling me how the mountain's quiet had surprised them. One couple said, "It's strange. At first the silence scared us. Then it started to feel like it was listening back." I smiled. That's when you know the forest has accepted you. In the afternoons, I often returned to Echo Ridge. The old recorder still sat where I'd left it, rusted and silent. I never replaced its batteries. Its stillness seemed fitting, like a monument to what listening had taught me. I started recording my thoughts instead, not as reports or formal entries, but as messages for whoever might come after. "Day 142, I said into the new handheld mic. "Clouds over the western ridge. The lake's surface is like glass today. Sometimes I think the mountain keeps its stories the way people keep old letters, folded away until someone's ready to read them. Those recordings weren't for data, they were for memory. Maybe someday another ranger would find them and hear what the forest had sounded like in 2025, what it had felt like. When I wasn't patrolling, I wrote. Pages of notes filled with reflections, half poetry, half field work. I didn't plan on publishing any of it, but words seemed to help me hold on to what I couldn't explain. Sometimes I'd imagine Howard reading over my shoulder, nodding as if to say, "You kept the listening alive." In early October, Lila returned for a visit. She looked different, tanned from travel, lighter in her step, her eyes full of that restless excitement only researchers have when they're on the edge of discovery. We hiked to the ridge that afternoon. The air was crisp, the horizon impossibly clear. "So," she said, smiling, "have the mountains been behaving?" "More than I have," I joked. She laughed, then grew quiet. "I read your talk transcripts. You turned your work into something beautiful, Ethan. You gave people a way to feel this place, not just see it." "It wasn't planned," I said. "It just happened when I stopped trying to solve the silence." She nodded slowly. "You found peace." "I think I found perspective," I said. "Peace comes and goes, but perspective stays." We stood there a long while, saying nothing. The wind moved through the grass, and for a heartbeat I thought I heard that faint, low hum again, not as a mystery, but as part of the mountain's breathing. Before she left, Lila handed me a slim notebook. "For your next story," she said, "because I think you've got one left to tell." After she drove away, I flipped through its blank pages. Each one felt like an open field waiting for tracks. That evening, as dusk settled across the valley, I climbed the tower one last time before the snow returned. The radio hissed softly, tuned to an unused channel. Outside, the first stars appeared, their light caught in the thin ice already forming on the edges of the river below. I spoke into the mic, not to anyone in particular, maybe to the forest itself. "This is Ranger Ethan Cole closing the season. The trails are clear, the weather is kind, and the mountain is at rest. If anyone finds this recording years from now, I hope the air still smells of pine and snow. I hope the echoes are still gentle, and I hope you're still listening." I paused, letting the silence stretch. Then, softly, almost as if the radio knew what to do, the static shifted just enough to carry my own words back to me, warmer, slower, reshaped by distance. Still listening. I smiled, turned off the mic, and watched as fog began to rise through the pines, wrapping the valley in silver. Down below, the cabin window glowed faintly with lamplight. The forest whispered not in mystery but in memory, and I felt grateful. Grateful to have walked through fear into understanding, to have traded questions for quiet, to have learned that not every echo asks for an answer. Sometimes it's enough just to listen. When winter loosened its grip, I found myself sorting through months of notebooks and audio files. The cabin table was a map of my own handwriting, field reports, half poems, coordinates, scraps of sound. Each page felt like a moment I didn't want to lose. At first, the idea of organizing it all was practical. I wanted a clean archive for the park's records, but as I listened to the recordings, wind moving through spruce branches, distant thunder rolling down the valley, my own voice reading notes in the dark, it began to feel like something more than data. It sounded like a conversation. I borrowed a small laptop from the visitor center and spent evenings editing. There was no script, no agenda, just one guiding thought: let the forest speak for itself. The first track I finished was 10 minutes long. It began with morning light on the ridge and ended with the low hum of the river at dusk. Between those sounds, I layered quiet reflections from my journal. Short, steady sentences spoken the way one might tell a friend about something sacred but ordinary. Listen long enough, I said in the recording, and the earth tells you it remembers every kindness. I called the series Echoes of Light. When I played the first episode for Alan in the ranger office, he listened without a word. The final tone faded, leaving the soft hiss of static. After a moment, he cleared his throat. "You know, Cole," he said, "I think you finally found a way to make paperwork poetic." That was Alan's version of high praise. He asked if he could share the file with the regional office, and a week later, someone from the Park Service communications team called. They loved it. They wanted to post it on the official site as part of a pilot project on soundscapes and storytelling. I hadn't planned on that, but if the recordings could make people listen a little more carefully, to the land, to themselves, then it was worth it. So I kept going. Every few weeks I released another piece. Rain on the glacier roof, voices in snowmelt, the last sunset of autumn. Each one blended field sound with a few simple reflections. I spoke not as a scientist or philosopher, but as a witness. The response surprised me. Visitors arrived asking about the listening ranger. Some brought their own recordings from other parks. Others just wanted to stand quietly on the ridge and hear what I'd described. One day, a teacher from Seattle brought a group of middle school students. After the hike, she said, "They're so used to screens and noise. Out here, for once, they stopped talking." That evening, as the kids sat sketching the mountains, one boy asked, "Mr. Cole, when did you know you wanted to be a ranger?" I thought for a moment. When I realized the forest was the only place that didn't ask me to be anything else, I said. He nodded like that made perfect sense. By summer, the recordings had spread beyond the park's site. A local radio station aired them during their Sunday morning community hour. Emails started arriving from people who'd never been to Washington, but said the sounds made them feel calm, connected. One message came from a retired firefighter in Arizona. "Your river sounds remind me of the one I used to sit beside as a kid. Haven't thought about that in 50 years. Thanks for bringing it back." Another came from a nurse who wrote, "I play your mountain winds for my patients during therapy sessions. It helps them breathe slower." Reading those notes, I realized something humbling. My small corner of sound had rippled far beyond these woods. The echoes I'd once feared had turned into bridges. That August, I was invited to speak at a conservation conference in Portland. Standing in a hotel ballroom after months of open air felt strange. The buzz of lights, the hum of HVAC where the wind should have been. Yet when I began to play the recordings, the room grew still. Afterward, a young ranger approached me. "You made me want to go back to the field," she said. "I forgot why I started." I told her, "Sometimes you just need to hear the reason again." When I returned home, the mountain greeted me with a soft rain. The trails shimmered and the air smelled like fresh cedar. I sat on the porch with my recorder, capturing that gentle rhythm, the one that says, "You're back where you belong." Later that night, I labeled the file Homecoming. As I saved it, I realized the project had never been about storytelling or soundscapes. It was about remembering that listening is a form of love, a way to stay present, to care without needing to fix or explain. Outside, fog rolled slowly through the valley. I opened the window and let the damp air in. The world hummed its quiet gratitude, and I whispered mine back. "Still listening," I said, and somewhere in that endless exchange between silence and sound, the season turned again. By late autumn, the project had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. The Park Service added an online archive for my recordings, calling it the Listening Trails. Each entry had a map point and a short note inviting visitors to find that exact spot and record their own sounds, birds, rainfall, footsteps, and snow. Within weeks, hundreds of people had uploaded their clips. Families, hikers, students. There were recordings from sunrise hikes at Mount Rainier, wind rushing through the Columbia Gorge, even kids whispering beside alpine lakes. Can you hear the mountain breathe? I spent nights at the cabin listening to those voices and sounds. They came from places I'd never been. Yet they all shared something, this patience, this willingness to be still for a moment. It made the country feel smaller in the best possible way. The superintendent called one morning. "Cole," she said, "you've started something." Other parks are launching their own versions. We're calling them sound sanctuaries. You might want to take a look at the numbers. We've had more visitor engagement this season than any in the past decade. Numbers weren't what I cared about, but hearing that people were coming for the silence instead of just the selfies, that mattered. A few weeks later, I received an invitation to speak at the University of Washington. It wasn't a formal lecture. They wanted me to lead an outdoor seminar with environmental studies students. We spent an afternoon sitting under a grove of old cedars near campus. I began with what had become a kind of mantra. Listening is not the absence of sound, it's the presence of attention. They closed their eyes. The city noise faded until only wind and the rustle of leaves filled the space. After 10 minutes, when I asked them to describe what they'd heard, one student said, "I noticed the way the wind comes in layers, like it has direction." Another said, "I heard my own heartbeat at first, then it slowed down." I smiled. That's the forest tuning you, not the other way around. After the session, a young man lingered. He told me he was switching his focus from environmental law to field conservation. "I used to think protecting nature was about fighting for it," he said. "Now I think it's also about learning to listen to it first." That night, back at the cabin, I thought about how simple moments could change someone's path. Maybe that's all legacy really was. Quiet influence that keeps moving long after you're gone. By winter, echoes of light had become part of ranger training modules. New recruits learned to record ambient sounds as part of their environmental assessments. Some even kept personal listening journals. When I visited the training center in Olympia, I met a group of recruits during their field day. They were laughing, trading headphones, comparing the sound quality of their portable recorders. One of them, a young woman with a sky blue bandana around her neck, approached me. "Ranger Cole," she said, "I just wanted to say thank you. Your recordings got me through some hard nights during college, made me feel like I wasn't alone." I told her the truth. I wasn't alone when I made them either. The forest kept me company. She smiled. That's what it feels like listening to them, like the forest knows your name. Her words stayed with me for days. I began mentoring a few of the younger rangers. Not officially, just long talks over coffee or while hiking. They wanted advice on everything: handling emergencies, reading the land, finding balance between duty and peace. One evening we were watching the sunset from the lookout tower when one of them asked, Do you ever get tired of the silence? I thought for a moment before answering. Silence isn't empty, I said. It's full of answers. You just have to ask the right questions. They laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that dismisses. It was the kind that acknowledges. When I got home that night, I recorded another entry, maybe my favorite of them all. December 8th. The sky is clear. Tonight the stars sound like slow breathing. Maybe that's what peace is, a rhythm you remember after forgetting it for too long. That track, The Breathing Sky, became the series' most shared piece. People used it for meditation, therapy, and classroom discussions. By the time spring rolled around again, the park had installed small wooden signs along key trails, engraved with short lines from my recordings. Listen until the wind becomes your teacher. Every echo is a memory learning to return home. The forest speaks in patience. Answer in kind. Sometimes hikers would stop to read those words aloud without realizing I was the one who wrote them. I'd hear them whisper, "That's beautiful," and keep walking. That was enough. One afternoon, as I was leaving the ridge, I noticed a young boy kneeling near one of the signs, pressing his ear to the ground. His mother laughed softly. He says he's listening for the mountain's heartbeat. I crouched down beside him. Hear anything yet? He nodded seriously. It's slow, but it's there. I smiled. That's because the mountain never hurries. He grinned, satisfied with that answer. Watching them walk away, I realized how far I'd come, from the man who once searched for answers in every shadow. Now, the same silence that had once felt threatening had become my closest friend. The forest hadn't changed. I had. And maybe that was the real story I'd been recording all along. The invitation came on a Tuesday morning, tucked between field reports and a newsletter about trail maintenance budgets. The header read, National Environmental Leadership Summit, Washington, D.C. They wanted me to speak on the opening day. The email said, "Your work with sound-based conservation has inspired a new way of connecting people to the natural world. We'd like you to share your approach." For a long time, I just stared at the screen. The idea of leaving the mountains for marble halls and fluorescent lights felt almost unnatural. But a quiet voice inside reminded me, you wanted people to listen. Sometimes that means stepping where the silence doesn't reach easily. So a month later, I found myself on a plane for the first time in nearly 6 years. Watching the landscape shrink beneath the clouds, I felt both awe and hesitation. The world below was still vast, still full of forests and rivers and unseen places where silence reigned. DC was everything the forest wasn't: restless, loud, alive with motion. The air buzzed with traffic and conversation, the kind of constant noise you stop noticing until you've lived without it for too long. The conference center gleamed with glass and light. Inside, hundreds of people filled the main hall. Scientists, park directors, environmental advocates, students. The stage lights made me squint as I walked up to the microphone. For a moment, I felt like an imposter, a simple ranger from Mount Baker, standing before leaders who wrote the rules of conservation. But then I remembered the forest, the way it accepted everyone without judgment. I took a breath, adjusted the mic, and began. "I'm not here to talk about policy," I said. "I'm here to talk about listening." A few heads tilted in curiosity. When we think about conservation, we think about protecting what we can see, the forests, the rivers, the mountains. But we rarely think about the sound of those places. We forget that sound is how the natural world breathes. I played a short clip through the speakers, just wind through pine needles, distant thunder, a single raven calling once. The room fell quiet. Even in that vast hall, you could feel the sound settling over everyone like a shared memory. Every one of these recordings, I said, was made in a moment when the world was trying to tell us something, not in words, but in rhythm. The sound of rain after a fire, the silence after a storm, the heartbeat of a river finding its way around a fallen tree. Nature speaks, but we keep answering with data instead of attention. Someone in the front row, a gray-haired scientist, nodded slowly. I continued. When I began recording in Mount Baker, I was trying to capture the mystery of the wilderness. What I found instead was the truth of it, that it doesn't need us to solve it. It needs us to hear it. Because when people listen, really listen, they start to care. And when they care, they protect. The applause was gentle at first, then stronger. When it ended, a young man from the back asked, "Do you think listening can change how we lead?" I smiled. It already has. Afterward, several people approached me with questions about integrating sound mapping into park planning, about using listening as a tool for community engagement. A senator's aide even mentioned drafting a small grant proposal for acoustic preservation programs in protected areas. It was surreal. All I'd done was sit quietly in a forest, and somehow that quiet had found its way here, into the heart of policy making. That night, in my hotel room overlooking the Capitol, I couldn't sleep. The city's hum was constant, sirens, engines, voices. I opened the window anyway and closed my eyes. Beneath the human noise, I could still hear something soft, wind weaving through the trees that lined the street, the faint rhythm of the world trying to remind me it was still there. I took out my portable recorder and whispered into it. Day 284. Somewhere between skyscrapers and stars, I'm reminded that silence isn't a place, it's a choice. The next morning, I had breakfast with a group of young environmental leaders. They were full of ideas. Urban listening gardens, national sound archives, school programs. I didn't have much advice beyond one simple truth. Don't rush to make the silence useful. Sometimes its only purpose is to remind us we're small. And that's enough. Before flying home, I took a walk along the Potomac River. The water glimmered with sunrise light, the same color as the lakes back home in summer. Joggers passed by. Children laughed near the shore. And in the middle of all that motion, I felt still. On the flight back west, I played through the audio from my talk. The applause sounded distant, like an echo bouncing through a canyon. It reminded me that every voice, no matter where it starts, travels farther than we expect. When the plane descended towards Seattle, I saw the first faint outline of the Cascades, their peaks catching the last gold of evening. My chest tightened, not from fear this time, but from something close to gratitude. As the wheels touched down, I whispered to myself, "Back where I belong." The next morning, standing once again on the familiar trailhead, I breathed in the cold mountain air. The forest greeted me not with words, but with the rustle of leaves, the creak of trees, and the river's endless whisper. Everything had changed, and yet nothing had. Spring returned with its slow, deliberate grace. The air softened, trails cleared, and wildflowers began their annual quiet rebellion across the meadows. With the new season came new faces, fresh recruits eager to learn what it meant to protect this place. One of them, a young ranger named Maya Torres, reminded me of myself years ago, focused, curious, and carrying that quiet edge of restlessness that only people who love the wilderness seem to have. She'd been assigned to shadow me for 3 months, To learn field balance, the supervisor said. Balance. That word had taken me a lifetime to understand. On her first morning, I handed Maya a small digital recorder. We're not chasing animals or hikers today, I told her. We're chasing silence. She raised an eyebrow. Silence? Try to find a place where you can't hear a single human sound. No planes, no cars, no radios, only what belongs here. She grinned. And what do I do when I find it? Listen, I said simply. We hiked together through cedar groves and rocky trails, pausing now and then as she tested the air for noise. She had a good ear, sharp and intuitive. By late afternoon, she found a hollow near a small creek, where the sound of water masked everything else. This spot, she whispered, crouching down. I nodded. Record 30 seconds. When she played it back later, she frowned. It's so full, how can that be? Silence. I smiled. That's the secret. Silence isn't the absence of sound, it's the absence of us. When you stop listening for yourself, you start hearing everything else. Over the next few weeks, I taught her what Howard had once taught me, how to read animal tracks not by shape but by weight, how to smell the rain before it falls, how to know when a storm is coming just by watching the way the trees lean. But more than any of that, I tried to teach her patience. Maya was brilliant but fast, too fast. She wanted to solve everything, fix everything. I saw so much of my younger self in that urgency. One evening, we sat outside the ranger cabin watching the sunset stretch gold across the valley. She asked, "Did you ever feel like the forest was trying to teach you something?" "Every day," I said, "but most of the time I was too loud to hear it." She looked puzzled. "Too loud?" I laughed softly. "Not my voice, my thoughts. I used to think being a ranger meant controlling the forest. Now I know it means letting it change you instead." For a while, she said nothing. Then she whispered, "I think I get it." The next day, she brought me a short recording she'd made before dawn. The first light of morning, a low breeze, and then, somewhere far off, a coyote's single, haunting call. "I didn't speak during the whole thing," she said proudly. "You didn't need to," I said. "You captured something better than words." That evening, I added her clip to the Echoes of Light archive with her name on it. When she saw it listed there, her face lit up. "You're part of it now," I told her. "Every ranger who listens becomes part of the story." As spring gave way to early summer, the park began to glow with the kind of green that makes you forget the world ever knew gray. I found myself talking less and letting Maya lead more. She had a natural calm that made hikers trust her, children follow her, and the forest, somehow, accept her. One morning, while checking a back trail near Shuksan Creek, we came across an old metal tag nailed to a pine. The engraving had nearly faded, but I could still make out the date, 1938. Maya traced it gently. "Who do you think put it here?" "Probably a ranger like us," I said. "Someone marking territory for fire lines or research." She smiled. "Feels strange, doesn't it, that we're walking in their footprints?" I nodded. Every ranger is just a chapter in the same story. The forest is the book. A few days later, we led a small group of visiting students through the ridge trail. As we reached a lookout, Maya began speaking about the land, the way the glacier had carved the valley, the unique patterns of moss on ancient trunks. Her voice was steady, sure. I didn't interrupt once. Watching her, I realized something quietly profound. My season of guiding was ending, and hers was just beginning. That night, I opened my journal and wrote, Legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what you set in motion. The following morning, Maya handed me a folded note before her final evaluation. Inside, she'd written one line: "Thank you for teaching me how to hear the quiet." After she left, I went for a walk alone along the upper ridge. The day was clear, the air full of cedar and thawing snow. Somewhere far below, the river hummed against the stones. I took out my recorder one last time that week and spoke softly. Day 356. The forest doesn't need heroes, just caretakers. We come and go, but the mountain listens forever. When I played it back, there was a faint echo at the end. Nothing supernatural, just wind finding its way through the microphone. But it sounded like agreement. For the first time in years, I felt ready, not to leave, but to let the next voice rise. The mountain would keep listening. By the time autumn rolled down the slopes again, I knew it would be my last season in uniform. There wasn't a single defining moment that told me. It was more like the forest whispered it gently over time, the way falling leaves signal change before they touch the ground. I'd served nearly 2 decades as a ranger. I'd watched storms carve new paths through the valley and seen saplings I'd planted grow tall enough to cast their own shade. I'd arrived here restless, searching, maybe even afraid of quiet. Now, quiet was the closest thing I knew to peace. When I told Alan about my decision, he didn't try to talk me out of it. He just nodded once, thoughtfully. "You'll be hard to replace," he said. "No one replaces anyone out here," I told him. "We just take turns listening." The next few weeks were a blur of goodbyes. The seasonal staff threw a small cookout by the lake, complete with burnt marshmallows and stories that grew funnier with each retelling. Maya returned for the event, already a lead on her new team, and brought a framed photo of Echo Ridge at sunrise. On the back she'd written, "For the ranger who taught us that silence is never empty." I didn't say much that night. I didn't need to. The laughter, the firelight, the smell of pine smoke, it all said enough. When the others drifted off to their cabins, I stayed by the dying fire. The embers glowed like tiny eyes of the mountain watching quietly, approvingly. I whispered a thank you to the forest, not for what it gave me, but for what it let me become. The next morning, I packed my few belongings into the old ranger truck. The passenger seat still had a tear in it from a coffee spill years ago. The dashboard still rattled when the road turned to gravel. Everything about it felt familiar, like part of my own story, etched into metal and dust. Before leaving, I hiked up once more to the tower. The path was half covered with early frost, and my breath came out in pale clouds. The air had that crisp electric stillness that only happens just before winter fully arrives. From the top, the world stretched out in every direction, snow dusting the far peaks, the river winding below like a thread of silver. For a long while, I simply stood there, memorizing it. Then I took out my recorder, the same one I'd used since that first strange year when everything began. The red light blinked on. "This is Ranger Ethan Cole," I said softly. "Final entry, October 21st. The mountain is calm, the trails are clear, and the forest is sleeping easy." I paused, searching for the right words, not just for a report, but for a farewell. When I first came here, I thought my job was to protect the land. Maybe it was the other way around. Maybe the land was protecting me, teaching me how to be still, how to listen, how to start over. If you're hearing this years from now, remember that silence isn't the absence of life. It's the presence of everything that matters. A wind rose gently through the tower beams, wrapping my words and carrying them off into the valley. And if you ever find yourself walking alone through these woods, don't be afraid of the quiet. It's the mountain saying hello. I clicked the recorder off and set it down on the railing. For a long time, I just watched the light move. Gold, then silver, then pale blue as the day aged. When I finally turned to leave, I didn't feel like I was walking away. It felt more like the forest was walking with me. One final patrol between friends. At the trailhead, I met Alan for the last time. He handed me a small envelope. Inside was a folded park map, its edges creased from years of use. On the back, in his rough handwriting, he'd written, "You taught us to listen, Cole. Don't stop." I smiled. "That's the plan." He grinned. "So, what's next?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "Maybe I'll find a quieter mountain. Maybe I'll just teach others how to hear this one." He nodded once, understanding perfectly. As I drove away, the road wound down through the trees in slow curves. The radio stayed off. The only sound was the hum of tires on dirt and the wind rushing past the open window. Steady, patient, familiar. At the final bend, I caught one last glimpse of the mountain in my rearview mirror, its summit crowned in cloud. The light struck it just right, making the snow glow faintly gold. For a heartbeat, it almost looked alive. And maybe it was. Maybe every mountain is alive, not in the way we imagine, but in the way it remembers us. By the footprints we leave, the air we share, the echoes we send into its silence. As the forest disappeared behind the trees, I pressed record one last time and whispered, "Still listening." The road ahead was open, quiet, and waiting. The town of Port Townsend sat on the edge of the world, or at least that's how it felt after years in the mountains. The sea stretched endlessly west, the Olympic peaks rising behind like a memory half buried in clouds. It was small, quiet, and full of the kind of weathered buildings that looked as if they'd been listening to the wind for a century. I rented a cottage near the harbor, its porch facing the water. The days began with gulls calling and ended with the low hum of waves against the shore. It was different from the deep silence of the forest, but the rhythm was familiar. The ocean breathed in its own language. I didn't come here to escape the mountain. I came because I'd started to understand that listening wasn't confined to one landscape. It was a way of living. Within weeks, the local community college invited me to lead a short seminar, The Art of Listening to the Land. I expected maybe a handful of students. Instead, 20 people showed up, fishermen, teachers, retirees, a few high schoolers, even a park volunteer who'd driven 2 hours to attend. We met on the beach at dawn. I began the first class with something simple. "Close your eyes," I said. "Don't try to hear everything. Just let the world choose what to give you." For a while, no one spoke. There was only the rhythmic crash of waves, the clatter of stones rolling back. With the tide, the faint hiss of sea wind. When they opened their eyes again, several smiled without meaning to. A woman near the front said softly, "I didn't realize how many kinds of quiet the ocean has." "That's the beginning," I said. "When you stop labeling the world, you start to meet it." Each session became less about technique and more about patience. We learned to tell time by the change in wind tones, to predict rain by the taste of air, to understand that the earth never truly stops speaking. I saw the same transformation in them that the forest had once worked in me, the shift from observation to belonging. One afternoon, a young man lingered after class. He was studying environmental science and carried that mix of urgency and hope I'd seen in so many before him. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked. "The mountain?" "Every day," I said. But I realized something. The mountain didn't need me to stay. It needed me to carry its silence somewhere new. He nodded slowly. Maybe that's what all of us are supposed to do. I smiled. Exactly. Word spread about the workshops. Soon we were meeting in the town's small library for evening talks. The windows opened so the sea breeze could wander in. People began bringing their own recordings, rain from their gardens, city fountains, the sound of their children laughing. We played them one by one, and in each we found a kind of truth. I started a local archive, a small collection called The Everyday Echo. Anyone could contribute. The rule was simple. The recording had to be real and had to mean something. Within months, the shelves filled with memory, tide pools bubbling, footsteps on wooden docks, the deep tone of foghorns at dawn. Listening to those sounds, I realized that I no longer needed to chase silence. I had learned to find stillness inside the noise. Sometimes I walked along the cliffs at dusk, watching the sun sink into the horizon. The light would stretch across the water in a long golden path, what sailors call the road to the sun. On those evenings, I carried my recorder but rarely pressed play. The moment itself was enough. One night, as twilight deepened, Maya called from the park. "They're dedicating a new trail next month," she said. "They named it Cole's Ridge. Thought you should know." I laughed, shaking my head. "I hope it's a short trail." "It's not," she said. "It winds through the place where we recorded that first silence." For a while, neither of us spoke. I could hear the wind through her phone, the same sound that had once filled every corner of my life. "Thank you," I said finally. "Don't thank me," she replied. "Thank the forest. It still remembers you." After the call, I sat on the porch and watched the tide roll in. The moon rose, silver and round, painting the water in light. I opened my notebook, the one Lila had given me years ago, and wrote a final entry. Listening doesn't end when the sound stops. It ends when we stop caring. The world keeps whispering, through waves, through wind, through one another. Every person who pauses long enough to hear it becomes part of the same conversation. When I closed the book, the town was silent except for the sea. Somewhere far away, I imagined the wind moving across the ridge, carrying pine scent and snow dust. I thought of all the rangers, hikers, and dreamers who would walk those trails long after I was gone. Maybe they'd find one of my old recordings in the visitor center. Maybe they'd stand in the same clearing and hear the same wind and smile. I took out my recorder one last time. The red light blinked. "This is Ethan Cole," I said quietly. "Retired ranger, student of silence. The sea is calm tonight. The waves sound like the forest breathing sideways. If you're listening, wherever you are, thank you. Keep the echo alive." I turned off the recorder and set it beside me. The last light of day stretched across the horizon, soft and endless. For a long moment, the ocean, the wind, and I shared the same stillness. The world was listening, and finally so was I. Long after Ethan Cole retired, the park kept its rhythm. The mountain still wore its white crown through winter, and the rivers still carved their silver lines through the valleys. Hikers came and went, footsteps pressing new memories into old trails. The forest didn't notice the passing of names. It simply continued to breathe, to listen. But somewhere in a small visitor center, tucked between cedar and stone, there was a shelf of recordings marked Echoes of Light. They played softly on a loop for anyone who cared to pause. Sometimes people would wander in without meaning to, tired from a long hike or seeking a bit of shade, and find themselves stopping mid-step when the first track began. Wind through branches, rain easing across a lake. A voice, calm, steady, saying, "Silence isn't emptiness, it's everything waiting to be heard." Visitors often sat on the floor, just listening. Some stayed 5 minutes, some an hour. Most left quietly, as if something gentle inside them had been set back into place. Years passed. The recordings traveled beyond the park, copied and shared, finding their way into classrooms, meditation centers, podcasts, and even a few city apartments where the noise never stopped. People began using the word listening differently, not just as an act, but as a value. A small plaque beneath Ethan's photograph read, "He taught us that to care for the earth, we must first learn to hear it." And that was enough. Some evenings when the sun dropped low and the air turned gold, rangers still climbed to the old tower on Echo Ridge. They said if you stood there long enough, you could hear two kinds of silence, the living kind of the forest and another, softer one that seemed to come from memory itself. No one called it supernatural, they called it familiar. Maybe it was only the wind catching in the beams, or maybe it was the sound of a man's life still moving through the place he'd loved most. A quiet echo of gratitude, circling endlessly between sky and earth. In Port Townsend, the cottage near the harbor still stood. Its porch faced west, toward the open sea. On its railing sat a small recorder, its light long faded. Sometimes the breeze nudged it just enough to make the buttons click, as if the ocean itself were trying to replay something only it remembered. And somewhere out there, on a ridge or a shoreline or a city balcony, a person would stop, close their eyes and listen, not for answers, but for belonging. Because the truth that Ethan discovered had outlived him. Listening is how we stay part of the world. It's how mountains, rivers, and people remember each other. And in the end, it's not the sound that matters most. It's the stillness that follows, the space where understanding finally has room to breathe. The world keeps whispering. The echoes never end. If you pause long enough, you can still hear them. Long after Ranger Ethan Cole left the mountain, the forest never stopped listening. The snow still fell on the high ridges. The rivers still sang their silver songs through the pines. The world went on, slow, patient, unbothered by time. And yet, somewhere in a quiet visitor center, tucked between cedar and stone, his voice still lingered, recorded in an old loop of sound called Echoes of Light. Visitors still stop when they hear it. Some listen for 5 minutes, some for an hour. Most leave quietly because something about his voice makes the noise inside them finally go still. Years pass. The recordings travel. From mountains to classrooms, from quiet cabins to city apartments, people begin using the word listening differently, not as a skill, but as a way of being. A plaque beneath Ethan's photo says, "He taught us that to care for the earth, we must first learn to hear it." And that's all the legacy anyone needs. Sometimes rangers still climb to the old tower on Echo Ridge. They say, if you stand there long enough, you can hear two kinds of silence, the living kind of the forest and another softer one, like the memory of someone still standing beside you. Maybe it's only wind, or maybe it's gratitude, circling endlessly between sky and earth. By the sea, Ethan's old cottage still stands. A small recorder sits on the porch railing, its red light long gone dark, and yet, on windy nights, it sometimes clicks, as if the ocean itself is trying to replay something only it remembers. And somewhere in a forest or a city balcony or a child's first hike, someone pauses and listens. Not for answers, but for belonging, because listening is how we stay part of the world. It's how the earth remembers us and how we remember ourselves. In the end, it's not the sound that matters most. It's the stillness that follows. The moment where understanding finally has room to breathe. The world keeps whispering. The echoes never end. If you pause long enough, you can still hear them.